Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Daniel Faas. I'm the head of the Sociology Department here at Trinity College Dublin. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the fifth event in this TCD-UCD Sociology Public Lecture Series. The series is supported by the Policy Institute here at Trinity College. I'd like to thank my co-organizers of this public lecture series who are with us here tonight, Professor Sinisa Malisevic of UCD, Dr. Andreas Hess, also of UCD, and Dr. David Landy of Trinity. I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thanks to Jakob Boanaya, who is filming the event again for us tonight. A few housekeeping rules first. Could you please ensure that your mobile phones are in silent mode or switched off? Second, please locate emergency exits, given that we are almost at capacity tonight here, which is very pleasing. We're shortly here to have the great honor to hear Professor Valérie Amirault deliver her public lecture on Muslims in Europe, Wales in public spaces and the current political crisis. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. But before that, let me make a few announcements. First of all, there are two further public lectures next term, one of which is on Wednesday, the 19th of March at 7 p.m. in the same venue here. And the speaker will be Professor Paul Scheffer of Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And the title of his keynote will be The Open Society and Its Immigrants, A Story of Avoidance, Conflict and Accommodation. Second, as a member of the steering committee of the Identities in Transformation research team of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Arts Humanities Research Institute, I can see great synergies between tonight's keynote and the work of the Identities Research Group, for instance around globalization, migration and belonging, as well as identity politics, which are two of the 6 thematic clusters of this Research Institute and theme. Our main speaker tonight is Professor Valérie Amirault. Valérie is Professor of Sociology at the Université de Montréal and Canada Research Chair in Religious Pluralism and Ethnicity. Before moving to Montreal, she held several different positions in Europe, including at the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the UI in Florence. Her research, initially focused on Muslim minorities in Europe, is today more concerned with the role of the legal arena in regulating conflicts produced by the experience of religious pluralism and on the ethnography of the relationship between pluralism and radicalization within an urban context. Among her recent publications are Racialization and the Challenge of Muslim Integration in the European Union in the Routledge Handbook of Political Islam, and Religion and Political Sociology in the Wiley-Blackwell Companion of Political Sociology. The topic of Muslims in Europe, Wales in public spaces and the current political crisis has triggered both academic and political debates. Europe has experienced increasing tensions in recent years and decades between national majorities on the one hand and marginalized Muslim communities on the other. Such conflicts have included the violence in Northern Ireland between native British and Asian Muslim youth in 2001, the civil unrest amongst France's Muslim Maghreb communities in 2005, and the Danish cartoon crisis in 2006 following the publication of pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslim communities have also come under intense scrutiny in the wake of the terrorist events in the United States in 2001, Spain 2004, and England 7/7 2005. There's growing skepticism amongst European governments over the question of Turkey's accession into the European Union, a country that is socio-culturally and religiously very different from the present EU 28. Questions raised both by politicians and academics include how much diversity can be accommodated within Western societies, how can we promote social cohesion whilst also fostering cultural, ethnic and religious diversity. In Germany, for instance, several primarily conservative controlled states introduced legislation banning teachers from wearing headscarves. But in cases like Baden-Württemberg, which is the home state I'm from, the ban did not include Christian and Jewish religious symbols, for instance. In contrast, the state of Berlin introduced an all-inclusive law banning all religious symbols from public institutions. Unlike in France, however, students are allowed to wear headscarves in schools without any restriction today. And I'm curious now to hear Professor Amirault's talk around this topic, Muslims in Europe, Wales in public spaces and the current political crisis. Professor Amirault will speak for about 50 minutes to an hour. This is followed by a 30-minute question and answer session in which all of you have a chance to engage with our keynote speaker, and we hope to finish by around 8:30, 8:40 tonight. So please give a very warm welcome to Valérie Amirault.
Good evening to everyone. I'm very impressed by the number of people that are coming to listening to such a talk. So I hope I will not disappoint you. I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first time in Ireland, and my first time in Dublin. I want to take the opportunity of the first couple of minutes to thank the organizers. From what I understood, it's a joint event, so there are many names of people I just met. So I'm extremely pleased, and I thank them for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about what has been my topic of study for the last 20 years. So it's a very, very research area. It's a very, very research field. As Daniel just said, it's been extremely and intensively covered by media, by political attention. So I'm not speaking in a void. I'm speaking on the basis of all the information and the flow of information that you've probably come across. And I think that's an important starting point, because I'm not addressing this issue in terms of gathering information. I'm not so much interested in accumulation of data. I'm not presenting you numbers, figures. What I want to do tonight is just to invite you to engage with me in a conversation about what I think are the most significant topic that we can relate to this issue of the veil, the headscarves, and more recently the burqas in the European Union. My main research interest currently is related to what I call the process through which the religion of some has become the public concern of others. To put it in other way, in other terms, I'm dealing with the fetishization of another religion and how this fetishization is feeding what I call the current political European crisis. So I'm not presenting rough data, I'm not presenting research results, but I'm sticking to a very, let's say, theoretical perspective on this issue that is being related to the way this publicly visible otherness that is embodied by Muslim populations in the member state of the European Union has sparked movements of transnational moral panic that have been mainly driven by the fear of the collapse of national cohesion. These fears that are shared internationally always become more pronounced when women are the center of their focus. So Islamic women attire, whatever the terminology we use to describe it, being the veil, being the headscarf, and more recently burqa or full garment, is presented as an increasingly delicate problem, an issue at the center of legal battles and the subject of virulent political controversies in many countries. And here I just want to stop a minute just to let you know that I've been working on 4 countries in particular, on the UK, on Italy, on Germany and France, and I will mostly stick to these examples. But I'm happy to engage with you in a discussion covering other contexts if I'm able to. And I will also use a lot of reference to the European Court of Human Rights decision and to the French context, because it has become quite shared at the European level. These occurrences of local friction, tension, disagreement, and more recently violence, as in France and Sweden over the course of last summer, have emerged in different contexts, regardless of the national conventions which governs immigration politics, the relationship between churches and state, and the wider construction of national identity. This per se is the first challenge to our natural sociological, methodological nationalism, to take on Wimmer and Glick Schiller's wording. So this lecture is more specifically concerned with what I call the public texture of the discussion surrounding the recent ban on the wearing of the full veil in European public spaces. What does the omnipresence, not to say ubiquity, of public discussion about religious otherness reveal about the current European political crisis? And my proposal to answer that question is that these occurrences are part of a racializing configuration about which I wish to develop 3 lines of arguments. The first hinges on the unintelligibility of certain manifestations of belief in secular European public spaces. The second develops an analysis of the racialization of the indicators of religious belonging, whether real or supposed, and which most specifically affect the Muslim population of the EU. And again, a parenthesis, I'm fully aware of the fact that we should, as sociologists, engage more and more in aggregating other populations that are connected to similar issues, but are still considered to be separated because they don't belong to Islam or because they don't believe in Islam. But I think this is something we should really seriously think about it in terms of sociological agenda. The third finally proposes some speculative readings of the public experience of the different crises arising from the visibility of Islamic religious signs and what I call the capital of visibility that is attached to this presence. I will then conclude with some comments to try and tackle an important question: what does the fetishism about religious attire tell us about the European political adventure? So let's start the first part, which is the longest one. The second and the third part are shorter. By briefly sorting out why I suggest that in Europe religion remains mostly non-intelligible to politics and to the public imagination. This situation owes much to the historical constructed belief in the absolute opposition between the rational modernity of the public sphere and the intimate and private experience of religion. Here the usual author that is quoted is Talal Assad, but I would invite you, if you're interested in that, to really read what Fitzgerald has been writing on that in terms of critical religious studies, which is very similar but goes further in terms of theoretical perspective than Talal Assad. The first point I wish to make is the following. The specificity of religious and cultural symbols, such as women's clothing, in this case Muslim women, brings the European public to a confrontation with the nature of the link between the simultaneously positive and negative normative aspects of the discourse on justice and equality. It also confronts this European public with its own capacity to think and react in a reasonable manner, to put it in Rawls' terminology, towards the religious dimension, and with the moral foundations that underlie this capacity for reflection and reasonable action. The complex challenge here that arises, and the one that European societies, in my view at this time, are still failing to meet, is to be able to develop and implement complex definitions of equality that practically take into account individual religious belief. The second point is more strictly related to secularism. To summarize it, I would say I've been working on that with another colleague, comparing France and Quebec. And what we are trying to show and to illustrate with this comparison is the fact that in both contexts, secularism, through the discussion on Muslim veils in particular, and through religious otherness more generally, has been displaced and moved from being an institutional political principle to being a narrative. A narrative, this is a concept that has been promoted by legal scholars working on secularism, is something that has no normative power, but still turns out to be quite efficient in the way it helps different arenas, the judiciary, the political, the economics to a certain extent, to connect around this issue of secularism by sharing the idea that a narrative on secularism means that we discuss constantly and we promote the discussion on what secularism should be. Not about what it is and how it works, but what it should be and how it should work to continue to promote its national capacity of bringing people together. So the public discussion on the question of Islam and Muslims presents secularism as a principle that needs to be reaffirmed and defended in its capacity as a fundamental European value, constituting both a path to integration and an indispensable norm for regulating social life. Secularism, in this sense, is increasingly regarded as a foundation for national identity, or evidenced by, as it has been evidenced by, among other things, the recent statements by the leaders of the French National Front, as well as in the reasoning of the European Court of Human Rights in different cases, but in particular in the Loxi case. I don't have time to develop on this example, but if you wish, we can do that during the discussion. The main analytical framework that supports the prohibition of wearing the headscarf or recently the full veil can therefore be summarized as follows. We stand by our values. In other words, the protection of liberal values, those historically considered the most sacred, to name a few, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, equality between men and women, means that society can tolerate restrictions on some others. The various decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, therefore, validate the idea that public space, as a place of citizenship, is not subject to the requirement of absolute neutrality, but that individual liberties can and will be curtailed in the name of the minimum requirements for social life, as these are defined by sovereign state. The garments that are at stake, worn in conviction and belief and forbidden from being displayed in certain public spaces, function effectively as transnational objects that simultaneously evoke the pervasiveness of the discourse on the failure of multiculturalism and confirm the relevance of secularism as a rational modality for organizing the peaceful coexistence of religions. Their banning, the banning of the garments, indicates all at once the securitization of cultural markers, the questioning of the moral and political loyalty of Muslim European citizens, whether converts or not, the impact of external politics on national spaces, and the efficient circulation of discourse on the Islamic threat, Islamic menace, often to the point of absurdity. And here I always quote the same example because it remains the most illustrative one. In Iceland, 2 years ago in February, the parliament started to discuss the necessity to ban the burqa on the island, while there were no single burqa on the island. And the discourse of the MPs was probably to explain that in order to cope with what was happening within other secular contexts and aware of this master frame of the Islamic threat, it would be politically reasonable to anticipate the presence of these garments by prohibiting their existence in Iceland. The third point I wish to make in connection with this idea of the non-intelligibility of religion is more complex and less institutional. The reduction of the wearing of the veil to a strictly personal decision has ultimately become the only way to consider it in secular contexts which do not deem religion a proper choice for reasonable individuals. These symbolic or functional interpretations of religious gestures hold up only insofar as to be able to validate the idea that personal beliefs can be metamorphosed into something that can be legally determined. The limits of European social and political imagination vis-à-vis all that is religious are also made manifest in the inability to consider the physical and material realities of daily piety and worship, things like symbols, but also ideas, such as forms of engagement, their perspective having been shortened considerably by the secular liberal gaze. Religious requirements are a matter of conscience, experienced as binding ethical commitments, and yet, from the perspective of European modernity, religion is understood only in terms of choice, an embodiment of personal freedom, with the believer free to choose from amongst a host of established propositions that he or she may also freely interpret. This is a dominant doxa in the literature. For Sabah Mahmoud, who shared the controversies raised by the Danish cartoons in order to analyze the normative encoding of the secular incapacity to understand religious insult, the moral impasse can be explained by the paradigmatic polarization around the conflict between secular necessity and religious threat. This rupture between secular liberal values and Muslim forms of religiosity reflects a normative view that Europe has of religion. One specific form of the religious subject, and not of a religious agent, is ultimately tolerated. The binary model of secular versus religious also explains how the veil is ultimately seen as antithetical to gender equality, to the emancipation of women, and to secularism. And I'm quoting here Giovanni. The veil has itself become an iconic sign of difference, but a sign reified to such an extent that its strategic use within Western understanding completely obscures and overrides the intention and motivations of the actors who define it. Just as Mahmoud has highlighted, this manner of conceiving religion has become as normative as a relegation of the question of race to the pure biology. This illustrates the dead end that secular societies face when having to rely on liberal language or rights to make sense of pious citizens. Their voices only become audible when they comply with the rhetoric of rational free choice. But as all other value-driven behaviors, in particular linked with identity affiliation, religious signs and ways of life are unstable and inconsistent. They vary all the time, from the insider perspective, the believers, as well as from what the outsiders perceive and see. In the 2011 petition filed at the European Court of Human Rights against France by a French national who wears the niqab, the woman's case was set up around the fact and circumstance of her wearing it freely as a personal choice, not coerced by anyone else. But the European Court of Human Rights judges have been having a hard time with the difficult task before them. In fact, and the hearing is tomorrow, so it's very timely, The plaintiff explained at length in her written testimony. Tomorrow is the public hearing, but she will not be there. You can follow that on the European Court of Human Rights website. In fact, the plaintiff explains at length that she does not wear her niqab consistently, but only after assessing, according to her own criteria, the suitability of doing so, and this in both public and private situations. The filing of the request was motivated by her desire to continue to be able to wear the niqab, and I'm quoting her, according to when she so chooses, particularly when the spiritual mood dictates. We can clearly see the affirmation and concretization of the idea of freedom of thought supported by the notion of a spiritual mood, which the plaintiff explains thusly, and I'm quoting her again, the goal is not to create a nuisance for others, but to enjoy accord with oneself. This intersection between legal frames, spiritual realm, and notions of privacy and publicization relates very much to the sensual and emotional, to the private experience of the individual, just as much part of the public sphere as the collective experience. The possibility for a liberal secularism is in fact based on the exercise of freedom of thought. Everyone may believe or not what one wishes in the private sphere without suffering any public consequences. Public space is therefore seen as a sphere that exists through cultural consensus and that enjoys priority over individual liberties, as I said earlier, all while clinging to the idea that religious practice can be reduced to private preference and personal choice. It becomes, this public space, a third space, that is, a space where belonging to the political community and citizenship are realized. Understanding religion as lived, but also as potentially inconsistent, is a theoretical imperative, but also a challenge we as sociologists should be systematic in pointing at too. While this may appeal to us as a potentially rich endeavor for ethnographers and sociologists of culture, it may also seem quite a challenge for scholars who tend to associate religion exclusively with institutional affiliation and rituals, or who stick to the idea that religion is first and foremost what is said about it. As a sociologist, I suggest thinking for a moment about the implication of this, and I quote, tension between the discursive and the phenomenological, as Idle Tavori has labeled it in his work on Jewish communities in Los Angeles. As the plaintiff I was referring to earlier pointed out in the case pending at the European Court of Human Rights when referring to her spiritual mood, religion is, at first hand, an experience in which the presence of the divine is felt by people, intimately. There are no visible and specific practices related to that experience, including covering. Covering is not a proof of the divine. It's a sign that someone is believing in something, including covering for women that act as sites for such experience. In that, and this is the last part of the first argument, the contribution of the law to the analysis of the headscarf's transformation into a social issue is most beneficial to sociology in terms of the attention it gives precisely to definitions. Defining religion is probably one of the most hazardous exercises now facing national courts as well as European ones, frequently through compensation cases for obstruction of freedom of conscience and religious practice. Is it possible to determine whether religious practices and convictions are authentic or not to religion? What becomes of the sincerity argument proposed by believers? What is the relevance of the dual demand of discretion and respect for cultural spaces granted by systems regulating the religious that are made to minority religious groups in a pluralist context? There are legal implications arising from varying definitions of the religious, which also affect the assessment of the sincerity of religious expression. Hence, debates about belief and religious practice are inextricably linked to issues of sincerity, which often, at their most basic and emotional level, emerge as accusations by one group against another, reproaching them for not being true believers. Secularism in Europe, notwithstanding the specific national traditions, conceives of religion in terms of institutions rather than practice or experience, what Nancy Hammerman terms the everyday religion performed through everyday accomplishment. This incapacity to take religion seriously is particularly well illustrated by the silence of anti-racist groups and their incapacity to take part in the headscarf or burqa discussions. The cause of the Muslim woman seems unappealing to anti-racist activists in Europe. This is starting to change around the issue of Islamophobia, but very slowly. perhaps because of the enduring nature of the narrative of the woman to be saved. Culture points out with regard to the work on people that have extensively worked on religion as culture, for instance, as Elizabeth Lavely in her work on the Virgin Mary in Bosnia-Herzegovina, she insists on the fact that culture only becomes a problem when it is manifested by practices, by perceptible manifestations. The discussions that took place in the European Union about what Muslims can and cannot do were never really about religion, defined as a system of beliefs and practices oriented towards the sacred or supernatural, but rather on rights of minority members to be present on the public stages. Liberal secularism is based, in its radical version in France, in a more flexible version in the British context, on denominational freedom. People can believe what they want in the private sphere. As a consequence, the public space is conceived of as a realm based on a cultural consensus that overrides individual liberty and on the idea that practice can be reduced to preferences and choices. But can practices be forever dissociated from convictions and from their consequences? In the second part, I want to relate this issue of religion not being intelligible in secular imaginary to the notion of, to the centrality of a discourse on race in understanding the process that is surrounding the perception and representation of Islam and Muslim minorities in the European context. So the question here is, to what extent does race continue to be a meaningful signifier in conceptualizing the European discourse on religion? The current moment in which it is de rigueur to bash the wearing of the headscarf or full veil illustrates also, I think, the construction of religion into race. Here, religion becomes conflated with race because religion, as a mode of subjective experience, remains, I just made some comments on that, largely non-understandable to European public imaginaries and political classes. As Muslims have been made more public since 2001, it is imperative to historicize this process of stigmatization by pointing, of course, to the colonial period as one of the moments in which a racialization was made of the Muslim. It is reductive to attribute the full responsibility of contemporary forms of racism to the colonial experience and its corollary Orientalism. Similarities in the public discourse can be observed in the way, for instance, cultural hierarchies are established and categorized through fantasies and precise iconographies of otherness and narratives of deviance. This is one of the reasons why I don't have a PowerPoint here. I don't want to provide the presentation I'm making with images that have really turned into icons in the public media sphere all over Europe. And it is quite fascinating per se. It has been extensively studied in particular by people, sociologists of media, but I think the way this dominant master frame in terms of images and photos and pictures is operating on our understanding of the situation is extremely powerful, and one way of putting it at distance is just to renounce PowerPoint, which I know is maybe very boring, especially because I have a strong French accent and listening to me is very painful, but I make it also a kind of axiologic position, let's say, not to rely on the classical icons, the classical images. This was a parenthesis. However, the fundamental binary underwriting these constructions of narratives of deviance and iconography not only draws a clear line between us and them, the Muslims and the non-Muslims, but also serves to distinguish between, in this case, good Muslims and bad Muslims. And I'm sure in Ireland, there is no reason why there shouldn't be in Ireland the same kind of actors that are embodying the role of the good Muslims versus the bad Muslim in the public sphere, in particular on the media, being TV, being cinema. There are a lot of artists, there are lots of football players that really embody this kind of dichotomy between who is a good Muslim, who is a bad Muslim. And it goes very, very far. We can discuss that later. If this distinction always intensifies in the aftermath of terrorist acts and or controversies related to Muslims, it nonetheless must also be linked to the difficulty of certain daily interactions between citizens. And here I'm quoting Shevene Razak, racial distinctions become so routinized that a racial hierarchy is maintained without requiring the component of individual actors who are personally hostile towards Muslims. The already discussed iconography of threat plays out and transpires also in daily interactions. It is articulated through the erection of public transnational controversies and images, clichés, that contribute to the production of a common center stage on which similar dramas play out, always interpreted by standardized archetypical actors. Islam is staged in public by means of religious rituals and symbols, by gendered modes of address, by manifestations and collective prayers, and by new forms of jihadism and violence that challenge and threaten the consensual values and civilizational attributes of Europe. The creation of an iconography of bad versus good profiles of Muslims was quite intense, for instance, immediately after the New York, Madrid, and London bombings, but also increased with the murder of Theo van Gogh, the Danish cotton controversies, or the intensification of the headscarf discussions in Germany and France. Through this designation of bad and good Muslims, huge controversies over headscarf, but also gang rape, urban riots, as was mentioned in the introduction, or global insecurity, confirmed the perpetuation of what I call a philanthropic attitude towards museumized peoples that are petrified into lifeless custom, to take on Mandela's words. They need to be saved from the outside, or they are incapable of working on their own culture themselves. And good Muslims are playing the game. I'm thinking here of a clear example. For last December, a new magazine was launched in France, which is called Noor, and the Light. It's the chief editor is Medeb. Medeb is a famous Tunisian intellectual, writer who was based in France for a long time, and who has been defending and promoting the idea that Islam, to be accepted, should be reformed. And the entire journal and magazine is dedicated through many contributions from artists, from writers, from intellectuals, from many origins in different countries, that is precisely fitting into this idea that there is a clear dichotomy between those who are able to do things according to the standards that are applied to them and imposed to them, and those who are not. So I'm not saying that it's only something that is playing inside Europe. We can find similar situation also in Muslim societies. But here it's becoming a classic, a kind of operating pattern in different contexts. If the continuity of institutional practices during and after the colonial empire, for instance, in the French context, is clearly apparent, the emphasis on contemporary iconic constructions of Muslims is rather ethnographic in its focus on the governance of bodies as the main sites for controlling, through sophisticated legal technologies, the modes of social reproduction and transmission of good practices and ideal virtues. The external signs of belonging to Islam, headscarf, burqa in my case, serve to classify human beings in reference to select embodied properties so as to exclude them from access to basic services: health, police, school, education. They equally contribute to the emergence of unequal structures of citizenship, as happened with the centrality of the figure of the Muslim women in need of saving. Razak shows, for example, how the regulation of the marital age of consent and family reunification helped the Norwegian state to create a category of citizens whose private life choices are extremely well and fine controlled. The author, comparing various Western contexts, in this case Canada and Norway, explores, for instance, the way three allegorical figures, the dangerous Muslim man, the imperial Muslim woman, and the civilized European, animate what she called a story about a family of white nations. She points out the articulation between a process of eviction from law of certain racialized groups of people, the routinization of racial thinking to cope with Muslim others in the West, and the revitalization of what she called a colonial governance. In most European member states, legal banning of headscarves or of burqas in France has become, for the last 2 decades, the central technology for governing the conduct of the Muslim person. Hence, anti-discrimination law is a site where race and religion intersect. So we are back to the first part of my talk and the positive and negative aspect of equality. So here, anti-discrimination law is a site where race and religion intersect. Although, as has already been noted, religion is also protected under the Freedom of Religion constitutional clause. However, whereas both European or French laws prohibit, for instance, discrimination on religious grounds, it is always race and ethnic origin or color which are in fact at the core of an employment anti-discrimination in both contexts. I was recently reviewing the numbers by the Ministry of Employment in the UK for an article, and among the 6 variables of discrimination, religion stands always in the last position in terms of efficiency, success, and also rewarding for the victims when they get their code. What is specific to the religious and cultural symbols that are at stake here is that they expose the normative dimension of discourses on justice and equality, namely the impossibility of objectifying some of the social facts that we are seeing emerging and coexisting in plural societies. The thoroughly modern anti-Muslim racism, which characterizes European public opinion, relies on what Cécile Laborde has called the new incarnation of post-colonial imperialism, which makes Islam into the other who cannot be assimilated, confusing the self-determination of the autonomous subject with the subjectivity of the white European male. In part, the lack of critical engagement with race may be attributed to many things, but to the web, for instance, culture talk has replaced the rhetoric of race in contemporary constructions of global politics, and the way in which neoliberal cosmopolitan theory posits a post-racial order, an assumption that has been criticized in different ways by people sitting in this room, as well as by Theo Goldberg and Gilroy. The new racism within the past 2 decades is coded within a cultural logic. It's not about race, but about protecting our way of life, as I was saying earlier about secularism. But still, they attend, and here I'm quoting Solomos and Bulmer, they attend to fix human social groups in terms of natural properties of belonging within particular political and geographical contexts. The assertion that racialized subjects do not belong within is then associated with social and cultural characteristics designated to them within the logic of particular racism. How far is the headscarf bashing movement indicative of a Europeanized racism? This is the last part of this second section. The effect of a particular racist discourse needs to be placed in the conditions surrounding the moment of its enunciation. It mostly serves, this is one of my statements, a dynamic of Europeanization, and I will clarify in a minute what I intend with Europeanization. Among its multiple meanings, the notion of Europeanization usually refers in political science to the impact of European integration on the domestic policies of EU member states. In large part, it conveys the idea of the circulation of rules, formal or informal, of procedures, of policy paradigms, from the European level to more national and local one. It either emerges as a consequence of the implementation of European policies or through appropriation by effect of socialization to European norms and rules. Research has therefore extensively studied the effect of European institutions on policies and politics at both international and national levels. However, religion is not a European common area for policy with specific related institutions. The Europeanization process that I have in mind here encompasses the idea of the emergence of a transnational European public confronted with the norms and morals of European secular modernity. It is, I argue, enacted through the transnational political affirmation of the existence of a cultural distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims. The reactivation of national identity discussions in European member states is based on an intensified politics of exclusion of Muslim signs and practices from public space. And here, the PowerPoint could be useful for one thing, to map it out and to show how the controversies has been historically following each other from one context to one another, independently, as I was saying at the beginning, from every national tradition. The reactivation of national identity discussions in European member states is based on an intensified politics of exclusion of Muslim signs and practices from public space, the equation of national culture with national identity, building a symbolic wall that defies and rewrites traditional boundaries. Europeans, us, fantasize a no-border zone. This is to some extent the case in the EU for some of us, without, however, escaping the paradox of still needing to draw frontiers inside this borderless territory. And I will now elaborate on this paradox, as I think it relates to the public stigmatization and racialization of Muslim figures in the way that it produced what I call a public texture. This is my last part of the conclusion. Whatever whatever the context, whether North American, because we could also add to the discussion other illustration, other cases, or the example from other contexts. The discussion in various secular contexts about this illegal covering revealed what I call their public texture through the fact that they actually co-constitute a public, a European public. Nations and civic commitments are revealed unto themselves through the publicization of the debates, for instance, through the fact that secularism is operating as a narrative rather than only as a juridical and political principle. The legal prohibition of Islamic feminine garments, which is seen as necessary to correlating the behavior of individual Muslims and to protecting national and cultural mores, is both a condition for a series of debates on covering the face that reconstitute the nation as secular and united. And of course, it illustrates also the potency of certain narratives over others. The notion of public texture I'm referring to is multi-layered. On the first level, I refer to the public sphere within which controversies, polemical discussions, and deliberations take place, and within which public problems emerge and are established. This is a very classical definition of what is a public problem. The designation, of course, infers the idea that the public problem did not exist prior to those disturbances that brought individual citizens together in order to discuss and define what disturbed them. And here I think the most significant school of, theoretical school to understand that is the Chicago School, where you have the first analysis of what it means to work with the public, how the public co-produced by different actors. And here we can rely on a very old-fashioned literature that says a lot of things on a very diverse and intensively changing city, Chicago. The media, politicians, civil associations, lawyers, judges, and citizens in general all play a part in the process of publicizing the problem. On a secondary level, my second part of the definition, the term public refers to the fact that the experiences of the population are handed down passes immediately linked to legal, political, and civil contexts, which together form a rigid network that dictates both constraints and any ways around them, and that in turn creates, again, the public. In the reflection on the public texture of the disputes of an illegal covering, I think we have to aggregate various scales of analysis and observation, from an interpersonal scale to a more social, political, and legal scale of analysis. From this perspective, the publicization process around the illegal covering discussions is, for instance, composed of the way people feel about sharing a common space in a pluralist neighborhood. And again, newspapers are full of letters of people complaining about, in very radical terms, about the disgust, about the smell, about the dirt, about what they feel concretely, as Dewey was saying about the experience of democratic public space. You first experience it through emotions and senses. So this experience about sharing a common space in a pluralist neighborhood starts in a courtyard, on a sidewalk, a mall, a playground, or a line at the bank or the post office. And this is part of my current research. We look at the way people learn how to hate each other by sharing very local places and sites in neighborhoods, in multi-ethnic neighborhoods, and the ways in which they react to the constant exposure to otherness and difference. This broader framing brings us to the unspoken and silent social routine in which hate, love, rejection, or isolation emerge, impact social life, and eventually degenerate into strong hostility towards those who gradually come to embody difference. Pluralism and democracy, to which it is linked, are often primarily addressed as philosophical issues or legal objects of studies. But if we take the Dutch example in the Netherlands, it is not the impossible solution that was invented by Geert Wilder. I don't know if you remember that proposal he had to tax the person who were wearing a headscarf, so to have them pay fees, practically, as when you're doing something wrong while driving your car. And indeed, to finish the parenthesis, in terms of judiciary and legal punishment, currently in France, the fact of wearing the burqa, as it is called, I should have said burqa, indicating that it's not my term, of course, but people wearing the full veil are committing the same kind of crime as someone who would have been drinking something, 1 or 2 glasses, and be driving. It's the same level of crime. There is no difference in the penal code. So in the Netherlands, it is not the impossible solution that invented Wilder that matters per se, but the way the powerful grammar that sticks to it has entered the Dutch lexicon. For instance, the idea of pollution. It started with a proposal by Wilder, and it then extended to other arguments related to Muslim populations, but still referring to Wilder's first proposal. So I think we have to connect the present global time of anxiety and suspicion with aspects of social interaction in the daily life, as well as with the meanings and emotions that spring from these interactions on a more global political level. This repositioning circumvents us from entering into abstract discussions about whether multiculturalism or interculturalism are right or wrong, which would be normative assessments, or better or worse than secular republicanism. Such arguments only further entrench the artificial juxtaposition between, on the one hand, the threat of radicalization and extremism, and on the other hand, the ideals of justice and equity. When talking about Islamic and Western visual cultures now, the void and its visual enactments brings us to the current interest both in political philosophy and sociology, first on transparency as a mandatory norm of policy in contemporary liberalism, and second on visibility as an emergent form of social capital. Transparency here does not refer to publicity, but rather to the idea that it has become an essential pillar of democracy in practice. The liberal individual performs the role of a good citizen because he is being transparent to his or her co-citizens. Visibility, on the other hand, is related first to recognition, both as cognitive recognition and as social recognition, and second to asymmetry, between those being seen and recognized because there were specific religious signs and those who look at them, the majority societies. Here, North American and European scopic regimes, or what sociology of art calls visual cultures, are particularly potent in the contribution to the maintenance of asymmetry-dissymmetry in the context of the dominant iconography, and the obsession with the burqa-clad female figure, especially when we consider that this takes place within a context where the social reality of the burqa is limited to only a few hundred people in each country. Personal recognition is always reciprocal and unmediated, while with the burqa, as with movie stars, for instance, or famous people, the cognition is made almost automatic as the image is multiplied by transnational media diffusion. With the burqa, the situation is even more complex. First, the subjective person is hidden. Second, the burqa is rarely experienced directly. People see it on TV, but very few individuals have actually met or wear. This solidification of representation, the one we have come to at present, contributes to fixing the parameters of what we may refer to as a field of vision. Everyone knows what a burqa looks like. The garment is immediately recognizable, independent of the context in which it appears. Think of Iceland, as I said earlier. And recognizable despite the fact that you or I may have never been to Afghanistan and encountered one in real life. They are, in this and all respects, comparable to celebrities, whom many sociologists have proposed to study in terms of visibility. Designated, here the visibility means the ability to be seen by others. An objective quality of people, I'm quoting Natalie Einisch, very unequally distributed according to the capital of visibility. This work is particularly relevant to reading the burqa as a social phenomenon, which consistently draws the gaze of those who don't wear it, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. We keep gossiping on that. We've been engaging and gossiping on these issues, and gossiping is a strong social bond. It is at once excruciatingly obvious and forcibly permanently exposed to the view of others. The decision to legislate against concealment of the face gives the collective a hold on said legislation's political future, despite the fact that the consequences of that decision, most notably in terms of the distribution of rights and responsibilities between the involved parties, have not been systematically envisioned in terms of the nature of the initial trouble, that is, the remote experience of visible religious otherness. To a certain extent, and I'm reaching to my conclusion, where regimes of compulsory visibility are being implemented, impacting on the public perception and social management of Muslim female bodies by criminalizing some of their gestures and attitudes. Specific specific forms of injustice affecting Muslim women are embodied through the specific politics of aesthetics, drawing borders around who is to be included and desired and excluded or rejected. In this respect, religious Islamic garments operate as transnational synecdoches, as Jiwani says, and gender, ethnicity, race, and religion intersect in mapping the boundaries along which desired and rejected icons are produced and circulated in a Euro-Atlantic imaginary, making power relations feasible. I'd like to conclude to say a few words on fetishism, as I said in the title and the introduction. I'd like to start by a quote from, and you'll see that I'm relying on very old-fashioned sociology, mostly male so far. By way of conclusions, Europeans are trapped, and I would quote Mills, according to Mills, the more aware they become, however vaguely, of ambitions and of threats which transcend their immediate locals, the more trapped they seem to feel. I think the current ordinary trap of European societies is what is called scopophilia. Scopophilia is the love of looking, or as some others have designated this obsession, a scopic fixation around the Muslim subject. While I was writing this lecture, a clear analogy rose to my mind, the one we can establish with fetish and the work on fetishism as cultural discourse. So here I'm relying on work done by others because this is something that I'm trying to develop, that I've started to work on basically a few weeks ago. To quickly define it, fetishism is and I'm quoting here, a definition by others, it's a key word in the cultural discourse through which developed societies have identified themselves by characterizing their others. It has developed in particular on three sides of controversy: the historical construction of gender identity, the social life of capital, and lived ideologies in visual culture. Fetishism proposes to establish a connection between human desires, material objects, and social power. And here I'm quoting Pitts. The fetish is always a meaningful fixation of a singular event. It is above all a historical object, the enduring material form and force of an unrepeatable event. This object, if territorialized in material space, whether in the form of a geographical locality, a marked site on the surface of a human body, or a medium of inscription or configuration defined by some portable or wearable thing, this reified territorialized historical object is also personalized in the sense that beyond its status as a collective social object, it evokes an intensely personal response from individuals. Just as with the ancient amulets of witches or the objects of West African origin Portuguese traders designated using the term, the headscarf and Islamic female garments have been reified and have therefore acquired an alarming fetish power. Fetishes were denounced as primitive and infantile and were prohibited from entering the system of equivalence that would allow them to become part of the capitalist exchange system. We're talking about trade here, we're talking about buying. They remained non-intelligible. Certain acts of physical violence against women wearing a burqa or niqab that have started to pop up in Sweden and France over summer 2013 have been moderately publicized, usually by anti-racist groups. The public discretion surrounding these acts of violence, these manifestations of disapproval of an individual's appearance in public, through, for example, tearing the veil off her head, can be found under the same silence that falls around the insults, threats, harassments, and molestations women have reported experiences on public transport, whether they are Muslim or not, wearing the burqa or not. These acts of physical aggression are easily overlooked, or at best seen as anecdotal, dwarfed as they are by the public drama of the battle for secularism and all its players, its advocates, its flagship institutions, and by proxy, the national history of the countries at stake itself. It is therefore not surprising to see, in keeping with the same idea, the little interest shown to the several young Muslim girls who, in trying to comply with the letter of the March 2004 law in France that was banning religious conspicuous signs from public schools, made the choice to shave their heads, thus radically endorsing the idea of the ancient mask of citizenship as model of equality. I thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for a really fascinating lecture. could we now open up the floor and invite you to come forward with your questions? And we'll maybe take a couple of rounds and bunch the questions, so maybe 3 in the first round. And when you ask a question, could I please ask you to state your name and your affiliation as well, please? So who would like to go first?
That's a French accent. It's a killer.
David Paris, Emeritus Fellow, Trinity College, Dublin. France used to administer Algeria, and Algerians eventually became French citizens.
Sorry, can you speak up, please? Can't hear you.
I was hoping the microphone was working. France used to administer Algeria, and Algerians eventually became French citizens. French women, as we know, eventually gained the vote extremely late, voting for the first time in 1948, a clear 13 years after Turkish women. But when this law was voted, Algerian Muslim women were excluded from the vote specifically. The Musulman indigènes were not allowed to vote. Does this legal exclusion of women from the democratic process, which only ended in 1956, I think, not show that there was always in Republican France a desire, if not to bash the burqa, then to bash Muslim women?
It's a comment, but I thank you for that, and it's an excellent opportunity just to insist on. I completely agree with what you said. Just be more specific and just maybe give a more historical perspective. The Republican project is based on an oxymoron, on a contradiction. On the one hand, promoting equality through citizenship in the metropole, and on the other hand, arguing, and the people who are arguing for both are the same. I mean, there is not 2 categories of politicians. And the second part of the Republican project is civilization of the barbarian territories. So Algeria, in terms of equality and projection of the role of citizenship, when you said Algerian women became French citizens, they became French citizens quite late. They became French citizens between the 2 world wars. And what has to be also underlined is the fact that Algeria was a territory in which the 1905 law on separation between churches and state was not applied, because Algerians were not considered to be reasonable enough to deal with secularism. So this idea of a double standard inside the Republican project is crucial to understand, I think, the long historical perspective. The problem is that, as Balibar has said brilliantly in his work on racism, it's only when we are facing crisis, whatever crisis it is, that we come back with this issue of racism being more visible. And as he said very, very accurately, this kind of racist structure has been an historical construction in France, as it has been in other contexts. So we shouldn't just focus on what's happening now, but just try to do as you just did, to connect that on a longer historical perspective. And in France, I would say this is probably the easiest case to know, tragically.
Next question.
It's over there, systematic. Ronnie Clinton of Trinity Sociology. And I found it really fascinating. I have to think of loads of things, complicated, etc. But I'm just thinking when you talk about fetishism and transparency, about Maida Yeganoglu's study of a feminist kind of take on Orientalism. And she talks about the West's need to unveil the East, not just the Eastern woman, and the whole notion of the opaqueness of the East. To what degree are we actually seeing this decolonization or recolonization within the European metropoles now? Because it seems to me that the desire to unveil is equaling, or it's an element, serious element in the racist approach towards Muslim women?
I have no precise answer to that. I just happen to work quite closely on Islamophobia and on claims presented by women to specific associations to tell their histories and experiences. And when it comes to discrimination of Muslim women, you have two situations. You have either experience, and then I'll get back to what you were suggesting, but starting from the field. The first thing is they face discrimination in accessing to services, to employment, to education, and here it's extremely difficult. The burden of proof makes it extremely difficult to demonstrate with no doubt that it's religious, that it's because of religion. There are a few studies that show it, but it's not something that is obvious and that is easy to demonstrate and to prove. And the other cases of discrimination are more of the kind you were describing, that is physical assault. And physical assault, more and more reported. We've just been informed of the last official data by the Ministry of Interior, which is usually downplaying the numbers. And the numbers of declared Islamophobic attack has been rising. And most of them are physical assault against women, taking off their veils, unveiling them by forces. And unveiling them completely, I mean, making them very often finding themselves in a situation of being not complying with the norms of how you should be dressed in the public. So there is a physical charge in these cases of discrimination that is underreported and that is very similar to what you are alluding to. I mean, I see many connections. I'm not able to say anything, but this issue of transparency came to my mind reading Marianne Harris-Young on urban studies, where she has she's talking about the ideal democratic public space in urban context, and she has all these analytical reflections on how transparency has become the axis of the way we relate to each other in a deliberative democracy. And I'm just trying to figure out how this need for transparency is being also enacted through this very, very physical aggression. Thank you, Ronnie.
Next question.
Hello, Jared Dowdy, I'm teaching fellow in the School of Law here. I'm wondering, nations are increasingly concerned about social cohesion, and there's some talk about different constitutional models. The UK's multicultural and France's secularism and Germany's Christian Occidentalism. Do you think that France's model is doing quite well as regards, some might say, assimilation, and Germany in some statistics not doing so well? But would you have anything to offer on this Christian Occidental model in Germany, and how it could be a slow burner perhaps in producing social cohesion?
What do you have in mind with the Christian?
The idea, as you said, or as you offered at the start, about how Christian examples are allowed, permissible, because of tradition. And like in the Lao-Tzu case, how the cross was an aspect of tradition,
okay.
not so much religion.
The reason why I mentioned the Lao-Tzu case was because it referred to religion as part of the patrimony. So basically the story, to make a long story short, it's about a crucifix being in a school or a hospital, I don't remember, a school I think, and it's about the fact that the question that is raised is it being imposed on other believers, and what is the potential damage of such an imposition? And then at the highest level, at the European Court of Human Rights, the answer was, this is not a problem because it shouldn't be seen, the crucifix in that stage, in that scene, should not be seen as something religious, but as part of the national patrimony. And this is a discourse that you see emerging also in Quebec. I don't know if you're following the situation in Quebec, which is quite intense and very uncontrolled in terms of discursive statements and practices, I have to say. But one of the questions was, should we, as a secular state, maintain the presence of the crucifix in the parliament? And the answer was, yeah, we're going to keep it because it's part of our patrimony. So these are contexts in which, but the thing is, it's not the national context. It's precisely what I was referring to when I said the difficulty with dealing with religious signs and religious symbols is that through the legal discourse, they are objectified. Maudud said that it was through legal decision that Sikh and Muslim, as group of believers, became ethnicized. So they became reified. Because you have to fix the definition and the attribution of meaning that you give to an object. But when I come to your question about the comparison between the national models, what I see very clearly distinguishing, for instance, Germany and France is the fact that in the legal reasoning at the local level, regional level, and even at the Supreme Court or Conseil d'État reasoning level, you clearly see the role of these national narratives, not so much as institutions, but at the way judges endorse these narratives in deciding and justifying their decision. For instance, you see secularism remaining an horizon through which the judges look at in making the decisions. While in Germany, the historical experience of religious pluralism remains something central. So there is always this issue of comparing, but you don't compare to Catholicism, you compare to other religious groups. And in these other religious groups, you have a huge minority and a small majority. You have Protestants and Catholics. And I think this is something that in the legal reasoning is really easy to trace and to observe. Much more than the usual discourse which says we have traditions of integration that are different, and I would say that UK is turning more assimilationist now than France, to a lot of extent. So this idea of philosophies of integration that would be divergent, I see that in terms of modeling, what we see is rather a kind of uniformity and convergence towards similar questions. And among these questions, I see two or three groups of population that are central: Muslims, Romas, and asylum seekers.
In the case of women being attacked when they wear the burqa, how can you decide whether it's belief is religious or if it's just because they were women? Because after all, there are lots of women being attacked because they're wearing skirts that deemed too short.
I'm not sure I understand the sense of the question. You're just saying.
I'm just asking, how can you decide if the reason for the assault is religious or if it's something else?
Yeah, that's precisely the point. That's one. I mean, no one is able to decide. Mm-hmm. No one is able to decide until the circumstances. It's very rare that an aggression, a physical assault, at least in the cases we are aware of, that are being reported by the women, it's very rare that it's only about gesture. It's also accompanied by discourses, by words. And in the words that these women are describing as the circumstances, as what the legal experts say, the wording is aiming at they are Muslim women. You should go back to your country, you shouldn't have child. I mean, we have a lot of illustrations of very, very problematic situations. The problem is, there are two issues here. First, that I think we're all aware of the fact that burqa is not the proper wording. The wording is rather niqab or full veil, or burqa is the word that I'm using here as a counterposition to the fact that I have not been using PowerPoint. I have not used PowerPoint because I didn't want to pollute the atmosphere, the visual culture in this room. But burqa is a way to remind us of the fact that the wording has a significance. And the first project of law in the French case was a project of law on the burqa, and then it switched. It shifted to full veil. But the idea is that you maintain a word which is not the word in the language that is spoken in the country we're dealing with, is also, in terms of power relationships, something extremely violent and very efficient, as it continues to say implicitly that this practice does not belong, before we even start to look at this practice. Back to the question. So part of the answer is linked to the fact that the happening is never happening, that is only a gesture. It's taking place in a setting, and in this setting you have discourses. So when we have the discourses, then the role of the law and of the legal experts is to determine who is right, who is wrong, who is saying what, etc. We have a beautiful example, beautiful being, of course, not the right word, of the, I don't know if you followed it, it happened in July, in one of the suburb in Paris, and there was this arrest of a couple, and it degenerated into 3 nights of riots, as they say in the newspapers. And we are actually now, the case of this woman is being studied, is being really documented, and it's interesting because here it brings in the police forces, because the person who arrested the couple are, of course, policemen who asked this woman to take off her burqa because it was forbidden to walk in the public space, in the public street with such a garment. And it was not the first time she had been arrested, and the situation degenerated quite abruptly and quickly. And again, even if on the spot the situation was just a normal procedure of the police forces, what came out quite quickly is that the 2 policemen that were in charge of this act have left traces. We live in an era of big data. They have left traces on Facebook, on Twitter, in the trade union newspapers, in which they explicitly state racist, Islamophobic comments. So you can't just, I think the temptation to disconnect the gesture of unveiling a woman by force from the religious dimension is in a way the confirmation of our difficulty to cope with religion as such. And I'm not saying that the full veil is a religious statement. I'm just saying that part of these women say, I'm Muslim, I wear it. The problem being, first, we have only in France 3 persons working on this issue. So far we have 1 public report and 1 scientific article. So we don't know anything. And we always see the same women talking on TV. The second problem is that when it comes to discussing this issue in public, it's now falling under the law. So it's forbidden. It's forbidden. You can't do anything except obeying the law. And what is coming up to the public now is that very often it's always the same women that are arrested because they live in the same neighborhood, because the police guys, the police forces recognize them, knows them, because you can even recognize someone wearing a full veil. So it's a very complicated story, and I don't think we should be tempted to have this sectorial approach and say it's gender and not religion, and how should we determine it. I think this is really a kind of reading that we should avoid. We should really be more intersectional on this question.
Andreas Hess from UCD Sociology. Your whole talk presupposes that the mainstream has remained unchanged. I mean, you talk about the hegemonic discourse and so on and so forth. You know, I'm not sure whether that makes for good sociology. I mean, you take a closer look into what's happening in the United States, you find out soon that the mainstream is no longer the mainstream as it used to be, no longer white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, East Coast based. And my assumption is the same thing is happening in European countries on different levels. I mean, you just take a closer look at our publicly elected representatives and you find faces you wouldn't have seen 15 years ago. I mean, the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Germany until recently used to be somebody who was born in Vietnam, and it clearly shows in many ways. You know, the same similar examples you could come up with in France and in the UK and the Netherlands. So, you know, integration and assimilation into what? If the mainstream changes slightly, maybe not quick enough according to our wishes, but it changes nevertheless. We'll talk about assimilation and integration changes as well.
if I understood correctly, you're saying that I was avoiding to address the fact that the integration to or the assimilation to, the two is changing. Is that right? That there is more diversity, that it's working, basically.
It's not work well. I'm not so sure how good it's working, but something is definitely changing. I mean, just take a look at Congress in the United States, where it looks like these days.
Yeah, I'm sure in the
look
States.
at the Westminster Parliament, the German Bundestag, even the French Parliament. You see people of origin we haven't seen
in
that
the French
before.
Parliament, I think that they are the latecomers to this issue, but I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing here. I don't think that the representation of the ethnic diversity of the origin of people living in France is really correlated to what I was addressing here. What I was addressing here is the way the stigmatization of a religion is being based on a racist and racial grammar. And in context where we have been avoiding the word, and we're even thinking of erasing it from the Constitution, as in the French case, we're in a situation where we're precisely able to say, oh, but it's because they're women, or it's because they live in this neighborhood, or it's because they've not been good at school, or it's because it's family behavior, or it's because... So I don't think we should collude the two debates. I'm not saying they're disconnected, but I think there are two different... They don't cross, they don't intersect. We're not talking about the same people. Very good example. In 2 days, we're celebrating in France the 30 years of what was called the March for Equality. In '83, a group of people from North African origin, the one we call the second generation, les Beurs, left Marseille and went to Paris in order to fight against, to express their will to fight against racism and ask for equality. The celebration that is being made now is a celebration that is completely, using the political token that this kind of aggregation of nice guys who 30 years ago made their way to Paris by walking and being welcomed. They had no money, they had no place to sleep, they were welcomed by the French villages, they were crossing, and they finally arrived in Paris. There were 17 at the beginning and 100,000 at the arrival in Paris. And this has been a strong movement that has been completely recuperated 2 years later by SOS Racism, that maybe you've heard of, and by the Socialist Party. And what is cynical is to see that in celebrating the 30 years of this, we've been seeing everything. A movie has been done, public declaration by politicians, a fake reconstitution of the march has been organized by one of the most popular journalists on a private channel. People started from Lyon and went to Paris, but without connecting with the problem of equality today. And the fact that, for instance, the people that were marching in the beginning of the 80s are now the same, that have kids, that are unemployed, that do not succeed at school, that are still segregated in the same neighborhood, that most of the funding for the associative work in these neighborhoods has been cut, etc., etc. So I agree with you that the situation is changing, and as a famous movie maker says, so far so good, for part of them, but not for the majority. And what I was trying to do here was to disentangle this temptation to talk about Muslims only in terms of religious subject. It has to be, I think, connected, and I disagree, and we disagree with many of the people that have a rather public policy perspective, but I agree also with a lot of persons that think like I do, that it needs to be read as a racial problem. And I'm not saying that the situation is not changing, but I don't think that the fact that we have a black woman Minister of Justice in France has shown so far that France has changed. I don't think France is racist, but I just think that people have a problem with seeing a woman, black, having this position. She has been the subject of extreme violent attack for the last months, the last one being extremely public because it was a newspaper. So far, no one has properly reacted with a public statement. They only started to sustain her once she had made a public declaration in a newspaper. And the accusation were of she was compared to a chimpanzee, she was thrown bananas by demonstrators. So things that were happening also in Italy to the Ministry of Family. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think this is, in a way, saying that things are changing shouldn't avoid les sujets qui fâchent, the hot topics.
And on that note, I would really like to thank once again Valérie and Moreau for a really interesting lecture and the discussion. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, good night.